So without being too repetitive, I guess, about some of the topics, let's start, I guess, with what the title of the book is, which is about ISIS. I didn't write a book about ISIS in the sense of what is ISIS, what is Salafist jihadism. I don't pretend to understand all of the ins and outs of every Islamist extremist or what motivated all the people that joined ISIS. I was very interested in the idea that this was a war that was being fought against an organization, at least what I recall in 2014, that looked like it was committing crimes that were reminiscent of the Nazi period. And what I mean by that is, for instance, when ISIS took over northern Iraq, as some of you may recall, they took over an area near Mosul city. Mosul's a very large city in northern Iraq. They took over an area of desert between Mosul and the Syrian border, which was inhabited by a religious minority group called Yazidis. And those people, ISIS, on August 3rd, I think, of 2014, took over a series of their villages and put all of the men and women into buildings like this. And then they separated the younger women and children from the men and the older women. And they took everyone out that was, basically everyone of your age group, took them out in the back and shot them in the head, machine gunned them, and then buried them in mass graves. And that's what ISIS did. And we didn't know the extent of the crimes at the time, but ISIS was very proud to broadcast all sorts of other crimes. It did. It broadcast, for instance, in June of 2014, the mass murder of 1,566 Shi'ite cadets. These were young men who joined the Iraqi army. They were cadets in the army, and ISIS had managed to capture a base called Camp Specher, where they were living. ISIS took all the young men out and cut their throats and killed them and chucked their bodies in a river. After that, ISIS expelled all the Christians living in Nineveh Plains. Some of you may be familiar with the fact that Nineveh Plains is, of course, a place in the Bible. It goes back to the tomb of Daniel, for instance, is near there, as well as Kever Nachum. The Nachum's tomb is there as well. So actually Nineveh Plains plays a role in Jewish history and the history of our region. So this was an area that there were ancient Christian communities. There would have been ancient Jewish communities there had, of course, not all the Jews left Iraq in the 1940s to 1960s and 70s. There is still a Jewish tomb in a village there called Al-Kosh. And there is a Jewish tomb there of the prophet Nahum, who is still there. The tomb is there. There are no Jews there, but the tomb itself is being rehabilitated. It used to have a small Jewish seminary next to it, and a shul, and the things you'd expect in a Jewish area. So, anyway, the Jews were lucky enough not to have been part of this. I suppose they would have also been killed. But ISIS expelled all the Christians. They killed all the Yazidis. The more horrific fate perhaps awaited the survivors, which is that ISIS took the younger women and sold them into slavery. And of the 10,000 or so people that were murdered in those weeks, around 3,000 are still missing, mostly women and children. They've never been found. I think when ISIS was defeated earlier this year, around March, in an area called Baghouz on the Euphrates River, there were around 70,000 or 60,000 ISIS members concentrated in a very small area there when it was finally defeated. And many of them were civilians, so women and children who were supporters of ISIS. People thought, well, okay, when they finally defeat them, they'll find a bunch of these Yazidi slaves or whatever. They didn't. They found 30, 40, 50 out of 3,000 that they were hoping maybe they will find them. So, like the Holocaust, I think in a very small way, because of course in the Holocaust you're talking about the number of Yazidis that was killed is like 2 days in Auschwitz, just to think of the volume of numbers of people being murdered. But I would say that what happened in terms of ISIS crimes, at least to me, reminded me of the Einsatzgruppen and the stories in 1941 when the Nazis went into the Soviet Union and just massacred people prior to deciding how to organize mass transportation and mass murder. So that's what ISIS was. I decided to cover that, as I think I probably said last time I spoke here, that I decided to go to Iraq and cover that. I also went to Turkey, the Gulf, Jordan, Egypt, other countries. Iraq was the most perhaps exotic or interesting place because for people of my generation, at least as Americans, I remember the Gulf War in 1990-91 when the U.S. went into Iraq and then kind of went back. And then we came to the 1990s, there was the sanctions. 2003, George W. Bush decided to invade Iraq and get rid of Saddam Hussein. And all of these people in northern Iraq, the Kurdish people that I spent a lot of time with, they remembered that period of the American invasion in 91 and then 2003 because the Kurdish region of northern Iraq always conjures up bad memories, I think, in this region, especially for Americans, because we tend to remember the Iraqi insurgency and all the thousands of American lives that were lost there. So it's always kind of this dark black hole. But the Kurdish region is not that. The Kurdish region in northern Iraq looks like a normal area. It's not exactly Netanya, but it's nice. It's fine. It's modern. It has had, I think, one terrorist attack in the last 10 years or something. It's a place that's safe. It's an autonomous government, so it has its own flag, its own army, its own airports. I spent a lot of my time there. I flew into northern Iraq by flying through Amman, Jordan, because Amman has a direct flight to Erbil in northern Iraq. You don't need a visa if you're an American citizen, or I think a British citizen, or basically from anywhere in the Western world. You don't need a visa. The Kurdistan region wants people to come. So that was an area that was a really black and white feeling in terms of, well, what is Iraq? What I expected in Iraq is, well, this is just going to be a very dangerous place. And, I wanted to see, of course, the war against ISIS, but I thought, like, okay, this will just be a huge chaos. Well, it wasn't a chaos. I got there in 2015, so about 4 years ago now. Well, I guess it was June. And there was 1,000 miles of front line. If you can imagine, Iraq is obviously quite a large country. It's much bigger than this country. So there was a frontline area that's a mix of desert and mountains and desert and plains and mountains and deserts. And that front line looked like something out of the First World War. I mean, it was sandbag positions with a little parapet that you could look out with a machine gun, and then more sandbags. And then what the Kurds had done, because once they had kind of stopped the ISIS advance in 2014, they had just bulldozed kind of berms about yay high, and they had just done this for 1,000 miles and said, okay, you're on the other side, and we're over here, and you stay over there, and we'll stay over here, and just don't attack us. And if you try to come over this hill, then we'll just kill you. So it was a primitive type of war once ISIS had been stopped. And that was in the fall of 2014. ISIS kept advancing in other places. It attacked Palmyra in Syria. It tried to get closer to Damascus. It did all sorts of other crimes and things. Still, of course, eventually sent terrorists to Europe. And as you know, there were ISIS-inspired attacks throughout Europe in 2015, and then there were in other places in the world. Those types of attacks, of course, remind us of Al-Qaeda or other terrorist organizations. There's nothing particularly unique about the truck attack in Nice or what have you. I mean, this is a type of, I think, jihadist, Islamist extremism that we've kind of gotten used to in the last, 20 years or so. But certainly in Iraq and Syria, ISIS was something a bit unique because it kind of created a state. It was a pretty big state. It was like the size of Jordan, I think, or maybe a bit bigger, bigger than West Virginia, let's say. So then it spanned the border region between Iraq and Syria, and it included around 8 million people or so underneath its rule. Most of these people, by the way, didn't join ISIS. I was trying to do the math once, and I tried to figure it out. Okay, so ISIS, they said, during different periods of its history, say between 2014 and 2017, when it was pretty much defeated, it still lingered on, but it was pretty much defeated, so that's 3 years. It had about 50,000 fighters at a peak, and it recruited around 55,000 fighters from abroad. So if you do the math, actually the numbers that were recruited from local areas, and they kept having to replace them a bit. That's why the math doesn't seem to exactly make sense. Well, they had 50,000, but then they brought 50,000, shouldn't be 100,000, but they kept dying. So the fact is that if you look at the numbers, I tried to figure this out, and I thought, well, how many people in Mosul? Mosul was a big city. It's like 2 million people or something. How many people in Mosul, a big mostly Sunni Arabs, the Christians had already left, so that would have been 2 million minus 50,000, but whatever. There were 1 million or so Sunni Muslims that stayed in Mosul underneath ISIS after people had fled. How many of them joined? Well, actually, it's 5,000, 10,000 people out of 1 million. That's mostly men, right? So you say, okay, well, that's out of 500,000 men. You do the math. Well, it's not a hell of a lot. It's like 1%, maybe less. That's not much. I mean, 1 or 2% to join a very bad organization. So the support that ISIS had locally was not great. I would say that most of the people that lived underneath it, who were all Sunni Muslims, because ISIS just killed everyone else. They killed the Yazidis, Christians, Shiites, anyone else. They even persecuted other minority groups, like Kurds, for instance, were persecuted by ISIS, primarily because many of the Kurds, of course, were fighting ISIS, so they persecuted them most Kurds are Sunni Muslims, but they persecuted them as a minority group. There's a group of people in northern Iraq called Shebeks. Shebeks are a kind of ancient minority group that lives there. Some of them are Sunnis, some are Shiites. Those people were also persecuted because they were kind of a minority group. But it doesn't seem like a lot of people joined ISIS, but it also doesn't. Most of them kind of went along. You know, I think it's like the Austrians under the Nazis. You know, it's kind of like, yeah, it's kind of great, but okay, we're not all going to join, but we kind of like it. So I think that's how we have to understand ISIS a bit. And what's interesting about it is the degree to which 50,000 or 55,000 people from all over the world joined ISIS. It had a huge amount of support in Europe, around 5,000, 6,000 people. Large numbers of them, by the way, women. In certain countries like Kosovo and Kosovo, Albania, most of the recruiters were women, not men. So the idea that it's all this angry, radicalized young Muslim males, it's not. It's actually women that were radicalized. And then the dude was like, yeah, okay, I'll go because that will make her, she'll think it's cool if I join ISIS or something. So it's not always a simple story. Large numbers of people that went to join ISIS, I think the selling point was, you know, it's not that different than soccer hooliganism, but you get to have a rifle and rape and kill people. So I think that obviously appeals to a certain segment of types of society, I guess, especially, I don't know where, in Europe and some places. There were people that joined ISIS from all over the world. Some of them came from China, or what's called the areas where there's Uyghurs and Turkmenistan. There's a whole kind of swath of Turkmen-type Muslims that kind of live from China all the way to Turkey. Large numbers of Turks joined. There were people that joined. Some of them were converts, for instance. You have people that converted to Islam that joined ISIS. You have, for instance, people from the Caribbean. I was always shocked when I read the story about people from the Caribbean, like Trinidad, joining. I thought, like, yeah, so you could sit outside and, like, drink rum and relax and, like, go fishing. Or I could go all the way to Syria and join ISIS. Yeah, that really, I mean, I don't know. But people did it, and most of them died, which is, I think, primarily a good thing, which is that they didn't come back to their countries, and they were buried in unmarked graves in the desert, in airstrikes or whatever. But when it was all over, and the book is, you know, about the defeat of this organization, there were about 10,000 male fighters that were left. They're still in Syria, and there were about 60,000 women and children. So obviously what that tells you is that most of the guys, the men died, the women and children survived, and they kept fleeing from place to place until it was all over. And then those women and children mostly live in a camp now called Al-Hol, H-O-L, or H-A-W-L, depending on how you spell it. Those people, some of them are young children. Actually, they say the demographics of the camp are like this. You got 60 or 70,000 people. More than half of them are under age 18, and actually of that, like 40% are under age 12. So it's primarily children actually in the camp. These are, i.e. what that tells you is the women that joined ISIS, they had a bunch of kids. So there's a lot of kids in that camp, and there's a bunch of women. Many of them are radicalized. They're not victims. Many of them are victimizers. They're women that were members of the religious police of ISIS, and in fact to this day continue to kill people within the camp because they primarily run it. Because the camp is, of course, secured by the US-backed Syrian Democratic Forces, which is this mostly Kurdish group in eastern Syria, but that's what's happened to them. So the aftermath of the war, and I suppose I always bring me back a bit to the Nazis, I think, just because it's an easy maybe point of reference, but when the war is over, it's not over. I mean, what do you think, what happens after the Second World War? Okay, Germany's divided. But I don't know, what happens to those former SS officers? They go somewhere. Argentina, I guess. But there's a bunch of them, and they have kids. So, that's the aftermath. And I think like the aftermath of the Second World War, when ISIS was defeated, we have to talk about now what has gone into that kind of vacuum. So if we look at this area that, as I said, was like, I don't know, the size of the Kingdom of Jordan, or actually I think someone said it like the size of England. You could do the math however you like, but it was big. You have a whole area, a size of a country, that suddenly is destroyed or collapsed by this war. And when it's destroyed or collapsed, something has to go into it. So if we look at Iraq, what's gone into that area? Well, the Kurds know, because the Kurds actually had liberated Kirkuk and Sinjar, some areas that were threatened by ISIS. And then in 2017, if some people remember, the Kurds had a referendum for independence, in which they all voted for independence, unsurprisingly. Why would you want to be part of Iraq? They voted for independence, and of course they were then punished by the Iraqi government, which closed their airports and attacked them in Kirkuk. And the Americans, which I have to say in the last few years is not entirely clear what the policy is, the Americans were like, yeah, well, the Kurds are kind of good because they support us, but we need to have a strong Iraqi government, because somehow if we're nice to Iraq, then maybe Iraq won't be working with Iran. So let's support the Iraqi attack on the Kurds, but only support it for 2 days, and then we'll kind of tell them to stop fighting each other. So you had this very strange incident in October 2017 when American tanks were rolling into Kirkuk, attacking Kurds who were also trained by the Americans, and the Americans were fighting each other a bit. Which, by the way, has just now happened in Syria, so we'll get to the point where it's happened again, oddly enough. So the Kurds in northern Iraq were punished a bit by the government, but they retained their kind of autonomy. Actually, Vice President Mike Pence was just there yesterday. So he went there. He met the new president of Iraqi Kurdistan, Nitshirvan Barzani. He met Masroor Barzani, who's the prime minister. Masroor is the son, of course, of Masoud Barzani. You get the picture that primarily it's run by Barzanis, which is basically one very powerful family. So that's what's going on in northern Iraq. And the rest of Iraq, if you've been paying attention to it, has sunk into protests and chaos. In southern Iraq, which is primarily Shiites, there have been protests for the last month. I think they began actually on October 1st, and then they stopped for a week, and then they started again on October 25th, of which around 350 people have been murdered or killed by the security forces, and around 4,000 shot. Now, it's interesting if you look at the Iraqi protests, and I think it's important when we get to this question of, well, what happened to the ISIS caliphate? What's interesting is this. So when I said, well, who fills the vacuum of the caliphate? Well, who filled the vacuum in Iraq? It's not just the Iraqi army, because they did, of course, reconquer this whole area from ISIS. ISIS had taken control of all the basically Sunni Arab parts of Iraq, where that means Mosul, Tikrit, Ramadi, Fallujah, all those cities you remember where the Iraqi insurgency was after Saddam Hussein, where American soldiers were lynched and contractors were beheaded and all these things, all those cities. So those cities fell under ISIS control. Within about 2 years, they were all liberated, and now they were under the control of not the Iraqi army, no, but Shiite militias. Because what happened in Iraq is very interesting. Iraq is a majority Shiite. Shiites are the same religion that you have in Iran. The same religion as you have, of course, of Hezbollah. So what happened in Iraq is very interesting. In the 1980s, when Saddam Hussein was in charge, Shiites were suppressed, and some of them, logically, went to Iran and received weapons and training and support from Iran. And in Iran, they worked with the Islamic Revolutionary Guard Corps, the IRGC, which is Iran's kind of shock troops or Republican Guard or something like that. The IRGC are the same people, by the way, next to the Golan that try to fly killer drones into Israel. They're the same ones that fire rockets at us. They're the same people that traffic precision munitions to Hezbollah. So imagine the IRGC like a massive octopus of which its head is sitting in Tehran. So these Iraqi Shiites, totally understandably, went to serve and fight alongside the Iranians. And when Iraq was invaded by the Americans, they all came home. They formed political parties. But because it's the IRGC and the way they think is, well, right, you should start a political party. But you know what you do is you should also have a militia. Because remember, it's politics. You need guns. So they did what Hezbollah did. They created a political party which has seats in parliament, but it also has an armed militia. And they created a whole bunch of them. And when ISIS attacked Iraq, once again, very logically, 100,000 Shiite young men went to join these militias, which were at this time called the Hashd al-Shabi, or Popular Mobilization Forces, PMU sometimes, whatever you want to call them. Think of it like Hezbollah. Think of it like the IRGC, whatever you like. They went and they fought, and they liberated their country, which is great. They should have fought. I mean, it's like joining the Soviet Red Army to fight the Nazis. Someone has to liberate Auschwitz. So the Soviets are okay. I prefer them over the Nazis. They're not great. So, okay, these people fought. They liberated their country. But just like the Soviets a bit, when they were done liberating, they kept going. So these Shiite militias went into Sunni cities. They took some revenge. They killed some people. And then they didn't go home. In 2017, the U.S. Secretary of State made this comment in Saudi Arabia. He said, well, okay, the war's over. Now the militias should go home. Right, because that's what militias do, right? Wars are over. They go home. What did the American militias that fought the British do? They went home. What happened to the Irgun in 1948? It stopped being the Irgun. It went home. And some of them joined the Haganah, and then they joined the IDF. And that's why we have an army here instead of like 35 little Jewish militias running the country. So that's the way you get a normal country, is you take the militias and they go home, and if you want to stay in politics, great. But you put down the gun, just like the IRA or whatever becoming part of the peace process in Northern Ireland. You have to put the gun down. So these people didn't do that, and unsurprisingly, they still have guns, and they're like Hezbollah or something. And so they took over all these parts of Iraq. There is, of course, an Iraqi army. There is also this Shiite militia thing, which looks like the IRGC. And there are all these riots in southern Iraq by young men. The young men are asking a very logical question, which is, okay, I get it. Dad and Grandpa went to fight with the Iranians, and Dad joined a militia. But I'm like 17, and I kind of like to have a job. And I live in Iraq, which is supposed to have 10% of the world's oil. And there's no clean water, and there's no electricity, and there's no classrooms for my kids. Well, how the hell is that possible? Where the hell does the money go? Basra in Iraq is supposed to be it's supposed to look like the Gulf. It doesn't look like the Gulf. It looks like a sewer dump. So people have been rioting in Iraq, and what has happened, of course, unsurprisingly, is that these Iranian-backed groups, with advice from Iran, have been killing them using snipers, and they've been importing a certain type of grenades from Iran and Serbia to murder these protesters, and they've killed lots of them, and they're still fighting. So that's what's happening in Iraq. I will say that these Shiite militias have expanded into Syria. Of course, because Iran supports the Syrian regime. So you have Shiite militias from Iraq serving now in Syria. So, for instance, one of them is called Kateb Hezbollah. Hezbollah, you get the name. It's Hezbollah like Hezbollah. It's the same Hezbollah. It's the same concept, Hezbollah, right? So Kateb Hezbollah has a base next to Abu Kamal, which is on the Syrian side of the Iraqi border. That base is next to an Iranian base called the Imam Ali base. And that's where weapons are trafficked from Iran through Iraq to Hezbollah. No surprise. They go to the Golan as well. And that base has been allegedly struck by Israeli airstrikes several times. The most recent time, according to the Russians, was an Israeli airstrike last week, which the Russians say that Israel carried out by flying over Jordan to strike it. And in June of 2018, Kateb Hezbollah also accused Israel of bombing their base. So you get the picture that from Israel's perspective as well, this whole conduit of Iranian influence is very, very problematic. That conduit has come into being through the defeat of ISIS. Now, if we step across the border into Syria, just for a moment, Syria, as you recall, run by the Assad regime. In 2011, there were protests. The Syrian regime was supposed to go the way of Mubarak. It's Hafez al-Assad's son, right? Bashar al-Assad. Do you guys know what Bashar al-Assad looks like? It doesn't look doesn't look like someone you'd follow into battle. They thought Bashar would fall. It was 2011. Gaddafi was killed. Mubarak left. Ben Ali left. So the Assad regime was supposed to fall, and it didn't fall. And so Western governments, like the United States and other governments, began to support the Syrian rebels, the opposition. The CIA, openly, not even clandestinely, openly, spent about $1 billion training these people in Jordan and Turkey. And that $1 billion went up in smoke. And the Syrian rebels were a failure. And in 2014, when ISIS began murdering Americans, like Stephen Sotloff and James Foley, Stephen Sotloff was, of course, sort of my colleague at the Jerusalem Post for a very short period. The Americans began fighting ISIS as well. They eventually called 81 countries to help fight, which is great. They helped to defeat ISIS. And what they did in Syria was, if you recall, in 2013, the Americans were going to bomb Syria because of the chemical weapons, the red line. And Obama said, no, I'm not sure about that. And as you recall, the Americans signed an Iran deal. The Iran deal sort of precluded the toppling of this Assad regime because the Americans were like, yeah, okay, well, let's try to be nice to Iran a bit. Maybe let's see if this can work. The Assad regime survived, partly because of those choices, which is back in history to decide which was better. But the Assad regime survived. So the Americans shifted resources to fighting ISIS. And when you shift resources to fight ISIS, well, you need to find someone to fight them, right? Because, see, the Americans, the way they do war nowadays, it's not like 2003. This isn't like Vietnam. It's not like, okay, the Vietnamese guy sits there and we'll go do the fighting in the jungle. No. The Americans learned from the failures in Afghanistan and Iraq. The way you fight war nowadays, if you're an American, is you send like 2 or 3 special forces. And then you get a whole room full of people together that are locals. And you do what's called by, with, and through. By the locals, with the locals, through the locals. The locals have to do it. All the special forces guys do is advise them. Advise and assist. Advice means, okay, they want to take some hill. And you say, okay, well, here's how you could do it. And they say, well, we need air power. And you say, okay, we have air power. It's not a problem. We'll help you bomb them. But we're not going to do it all for you. We're not going to kill civilians. So, okay, if we see an ISIS guy come out of a tunnel, we'll bomb him. But you need to take that hill. You do it, not us. That's how the Americans fight war. That's why, for instance, in the Battle of Mosul, it took 9 months to take Mosul with the Iraqi army and the Shiite militias. Well, the militias were excluded from the urban area of Mosul, so actually it had to be the Iraqi army. That's why it was so slow. So it took 9 months to take Mosul. There were only 5,000 ISIS fighters in Mosul. You know how long it took ISIS to take Mosul originally? 1 day. It took 9 months to take it back. So I can't say, but that's how the Americans waged war. And in Syria, they were very, very lucky in eastern Syria because they discovered a Kurdish group called the YPG. YPG stands for People's Protection Units. According to the Turks, and also the Americans, basically, the YPG is linked to the PKK, the Kurdistan Workers' Party. The PKK, as you probably recall, was at some point certainly a terrorist organization fighting Turkey. Actually, the PKK, interestingly enough, a long time ago, was involved in Lebanon as well because it was part of this kind of pan-leftist revolutionary terrorist alliance. It actually even fought a small battle with the Israelis many decades ago in the 80s. Very small battle. The PKK has maybe an unsavory past, but it has changed dramatically, and with the American working with it, it became something called the Syrian Democratic Forces, SDF. Because the Americans were smart. They said, well, listen, we can't work with the YPG because it's kind of like the PKK. Well, what we need to do is you need to rebrand yourself as something else. Which is fine because people rebrand themselves, like the IRA becomes Sinn Féin or whatever. I don't know. I mean, Fatah becomes the Palestinian Authority. So, I mean, we're used to rebranding things. It's not the first time that an organization with unsavory past maybe became something else. And I would say, for instance, in our history, I think that the Irgun was accused, of course, of being a terrorist group. But, of course, it became a very responsible, at some point, a government. So, I mean, it's okay. That's life. People change. So, the SDF recruited 100,000 people in eastern Syria, most of whom were Kurdish, although I think 20-30% were Arabs. And they defeated ISIS. Actually, they did it very successfully. They lost about 10,000 men and women doing it. Actually, there are a lot of women that joined. So because the whole nature of the SDF and PKK thing is like, well, it's got to be equal, men and women. So they have a lot of women fighters. And they defeated ISIS, and 10,000 of them died doing it. And the Americans, seemed like they were going to keep working with this group. And from Israel's perspective, that was great too, because, if the SDF is there, then the Iranians won't be there. The more American and Kurdish presence you have, the less chance you have enemies seeping in. So up until October 6th, well, let's go back. December 2018, Donald Trump has a conversation with Recep Tayyip Erdogan, the president of Turkey. For whatever reason, Turkey is able to convince the Americans, or Trump, listen, why are you there? You're wasting money in eastern Syria. I'll do it. So for whatever reason, Trump decides, well, you're right. I don't really care about eastern Syria. As Trump, I think, has said it publicly, it's just sand and death. Who cares about it? Let them die. So Trump decides to leave, and then, of course, as you may recall, his defense secretary, James Mattis, quits, and Trump decides, okay, you know what, I think I'll stay. Sort of. John Bolton is, of course, at that time National Security Advisor, Mike Pompeo, Secretary of State. As you may recall, John Bolton comes to Israel at some point, and he even tells us, well, we're not leaving Syria until the Iranians leave. That's kind of cool. So the American policy in Syria had shifted. It had been against Assad, sort of, and then for the rebels, and then against ISIS, and now it was going to be against Iran. Well, that's fine. So it kept shifting. The Americans changed their policy a bit. And then, of course, Bolton, of course, left eventually, and Trump had another phone call with Erdogan on October 6th. And for whatever reason, Erdogan once again said, listen, I'm going to attack the SDF because I view them as terrorists. I don't want the American soldiers in the way, and I don't know why you're there in the first place. And Trump said, I guess you're right. Screw it. So the Americans decided to leave. But they didn't leave the whole room. They just left part of it and let the Turks attack it and kill a bunch. Actually, the Americans had trained 100,000 members of the SDF. The Turks attacked their own partners and killed 400 of them. The Turks, of course, are an American ally. So you've got one ally killing your other ally, and you're looking on like, I don't know what to do. So this was a huge chaos in October. 14,000 Kurds fled to the Kurdistan region of Iraq. Large numbers of people lost their homes. The Turks are involved in openly ethnically cleansing people. Turkey says it's going to resettle a bunch of Arabs that have fled from other parts of Syria in that area. Turkey's been using a bunch of Syrian rebel groups that, by the way, when the CIA dropped the ball and said, okay, we're not going to support these crazy rebels that aren't doing anything anymore, most of the rebels turned to Turkey. Of course, unsurprisingly, Turkey is run by not only Erdogan, but Erdogan is linked to the Muslim Brotherhood, which is linked to Hamas. And if you recall, by the way, the Gaza flotilla, those were Erdogan's people as well. So those are the kind of people that support the rebels. And the rebels are a mix of groups, some of which are very, very bad and have been accused of numerous human rights violations. Anyway, Erdogan has decided to use them against the Kurds because from Erdogan's point of view, it's great. Let the rebels fight the Kurds. They all fight each other. And Erdogan can work with the Russians because, of course, the Turks are buying air defense from the Russians. The Russians, as you recall, probably support the Syrian regime. And so do the Iranians. And you're like, yeah, but I don't understand. The Turks are on one side and supposedly fighting the Russians, but actually they're not because they're actually buying S-400s and doing oil deals with them. It doesn't make sense. From Turkey's point of view, it makes complete sense. You get the Syrian rebels to kind of be beholden and dependent on you, and you get them to fight the PKK, and then they all fight each other. Meanwhile, over here, you work with the Russians and the Iranians for the big picture politics. Because anyway, Turkey and the Iranians agree on one thing. They hate Israel. Then that's not a secret. The Iranians openly hate Israel and say, we'll destroy it. Turkey just says that Israel, I think at the UN in September, he says, Israel is similar to Nazi Germany. So that's not very nice. So that's kind of where we are. I mean, the Americans sort of betrayed their Kurdish allies. Of course, from the American State Department's point of view, it's not betrayal because, the State Department said, look, this relationship is tactical and transactional and temporary. By the way, if a guy says that to a woman and says, this relationship is tactical and transactional and temporary, I think we understand she's kind of maybe a prostitute. So, I hate to be mean about what happened to the Kurds. I think they were treated very shabbily. I think that they were stabbed in the back by the State Department. I think that the Pentagon didn't say that to them. The Pentagon was arming them and training them and loves them. So you've unfortunately, got an American government that is like, one hand doesn't know what the other hand is doing. And I, by the way, don't think other governments behave that way. I think that Israel, for instance, the foreign ministry and the people that do secret operations in the army kind of agree on things. I mean, of course, typical of foreign ministries or foreign offices may be slightly more liberal, progressive, or what have you, and it's fine. But they generally kind of agree on certain policies. Iran, by the way, combines very well the political and the military. As I said, Iran is very good at saying, okay, well, you'll be a politician, but you'll also have a militia with you. That's what Iran knows how to do. And the Turks are very good at it as well. I mean, Turkey, say what you will, they've actually been very successful in the region. They They have been able to work with the Russians and work with the Iranians. With Iran, for instance, they have a lot of trade. And this whole idea that, well, yeah, but Turkey's the Ottoman Empire and Iran is Persia. You see, they have to fight each other. Turkey's Sunni, Iran's Shia. No. They don't fight each other. Turkey is very close to Iran. It wants to work with Iran. The IRGC, it was just revealed, met secretly with the Muslim Brotherhood in 2014, according to recently leaked Iranian cables. And they said, we need to work together against Saudi Arabia. And you're like, yeah, but I don't understand. I thought that Turkey is Sunni and Saudi Arabia is Sunni. It's not like that. Saudi Arabia is Sunni, but Saudi Arabia is against the Muslim Brotherhood. Saudi Arabia supports Sisi. Sisi overthrew Morsi, who was the Muslim Brotherhood in Egypt. They don't like each. They don't get along with each other. It's not so simple. So that's the kind of world that is come out of this whole after ISIS thing. And I think this book chronicles basically most of what I've told you here in different ways. It has other vignettes as well about Senegal, about the Gulf. I spent time in 2015 with a lot of refugees in Eastern Europe. So it has, of course, other stories in it as well. That's kind of where we are. I think ISIS is defeated. ISIS is not coming back. ISIS is very bad. It's good it's not coming back. There's, of course, 10,000 ISIS fighters that someone needs to take them home or put them on trial. There's no taste in the international community these days for a Nuremberg-style trial. That's not going to happen. Everyone wants to just pretend this didn't happen. The Iranians are taking over Iraq and Syria and Lebanon, and that's a 20 or 30-year process. It's not like they got up yesterday and were like, I think we'll take over Iraq. No. Iranians have just been doing that for 40 years. And that's the thing. When you plan 40 years ahead, you kind of can get there. And when you do it, the Americans unfortunately do in this region, which is plan like 4 years ahead because they're going to switch presidents every few years. I'm an American. I like America. But that's unfortunately what happens. So you have a hard time doing long-term planning. I think that in Israel, we've had 10 years of one leader. That may be ending soon, but of course I think Netanyahu has a certain type of worldview. Whether you disagree or agree with it, it's a worldview that is into this idea. So, well, Israel has covert relations with the Gulf. Israel's against Iran, et cetera, et cetera. So that's kind of where we are. And of course, you can ask me any other questions you'd like. I'm happy to answer them, I think. And is that good? Yeah?
Yeah.
Okay.
Follows my mind. Can you take the